Good afternoon, everybody. We are now about to begin the webinar. It is 1 o'clock here in London. My name is John Mitchell, and I'd like to welcome you to this ALNAP HPG webinar to mark the 10th year anniversary of the international response to the Indian Ocean tsunami and the 5-year anniversary of the Haiti earthquake. Now, our aim over the next 90 minutes is to hear from key people who were directly involved in one or both of these crises. And we want to find out what worked and what didn't. And we're going to ask, is the humanitarian system applying the lessons learned from these mega catastrophes? And if not, why not? And we want not only to focus on the immediate relief response, but also the longer term consequences of aid. And to help us do this, we're in a very fortunate position to have 3 special guest panelists, all of whom have a wealth of experience in disaster response and are also known as thought leaders in their particular field. Now, before I introduce you to our panelists, we're going to carry out a short survey. And in a moment, you will see 2 questions pop up on your screen. And I understand the questions are about your involvement in the 2 humanitarian responses that I've just referred to, and in what capacity you were involved in these responses. And so please, when these pop up, please could you tick the statement that applies to you, and we will compile the results to get a better sense of you, the participants, and we'll share these results with you as soon as we have them. So while you're ticking your boxes, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. And so first, on the line from Aceh in Indonesia, we're joined by Azwar Hasan. Now, Azwar was born in Aceh and is indeed a survivor of the tsunami tidal surge itself, and is also the founder of FBA, which is a local government organization that promotes sustainable development through education and economic development. Azwar is also the founder of a national movement that encourages young people to live beyond themselves and make the world a better place. And in Indonesia, I understand that this movement is often known as a giving back moment. Now, over in London, in England, we're joined by Jo de Silva, who's a director at Arup, where she leads on international development. Now, Jo was involved in the response to the Rwandan genocide. She gave shelter advice following Hurricane Mitch in 1998, and she coordinated the construction of 60,000 shelters in Sri Lanka following the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And Jo is also a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and last year she was awarded an OBE for services to engineering and humanitarian relief. And over in apparently a very, very snowy Washington, D.C., we're pleased to welcome Dr. Joseph Leitmann. Now, Joseph has 25 years' experience working for the World Bank as a risk management specialist. Now, he spent 4 years managing the $400 million Haiti Reconstruction Fund, which supported post-earthquake activities, and he also developed and managed the $650 million multi-donor fund for rebuilding in Indonesia after the tsunami. So I'm just going to check with my technicians here to see if we have the results of the survey. We don't have the results of the survey, so we'll come back to that later. So for the next 55 minutes, our panelists are going to make some brief presentations and answer some questions on their experience. And after that, we are going to put some questions to you. Some of these questions we've received in advance, and thank you to all of those who have submitted questions. We've had a lot. And my apologies to those of you whose question we couldn't fit in. We did try and cluster your questions around emerging themes, and so hopefully we'll have caught most of the issues in our net there. And when you do submit your questions, if you could say where you're actually located at the moment and your affiliation, that will be very much appreciated. And we'll then move on to live questions, and we hope to finish at 14:30, 2:30 London time. Good. Right, that's the preliminaries out of the way. So I'm going to turn to Azwar first. But before I do, I want to tell you all that that the reason that Azwar set up the Forum Bangun, this organization in Indonesia, that he and his family were directly affected by the tidal surge which caused the tsunami. And I'm going to ask Azwar if he could tell us a little bit about his personal experiences 10 years ago and what he has done since. And so Azwar, please, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for ALNAP for this very great opportunity, and good afternoon for our friend in Northern Hemisphere, and good evening for our friend in Southern Hemisphere. Yes, as John said, that I'm Achenese. I was born there. I grew up there, and after when tsunami started in Aceh, I was not in Aceh, but in Jakarta. But then second day, I went back to Aceh for the reason of finding my own family, because then I found out later that 10 of my family members took away by tsunami. It was extremely difficult because you can't contact anybody, you don't know where to go, you don't know where is your mom, your brother and sister. So almost a week that is you don't know what to do, and it was like the end of the day. But then life must go on. So then I ended up it's a place at a big extension family with my uncle. It's a place like what is 100 people in one tent. So I decided to stay with them, and that day changed my life, because before that I've been working for a lecturer at University of Indonesia in Jakarta, and working also for a consultant. Then that is the story. I think I have to do something, or we have to do something. In that time you cannot ask other people, and then I know that how that you have to rely on your own. So this is why then I was not intended to establish any organization or whatsoever, but then FBR come as the like collective work from the volunteers. It's been working in Aceh on people to people basis, and also the survivor try to help themselves. So then they become what do you call it, working together and stay there together night and days. Then that is how SBR was started. SBR is a non-government organization. It's more like a type of community-based organization and working in Aceh. So before I start my slide presentation, I would say that this is what I would like to say in this presentation is really my personal experience and observations, and this is purely drawn from Aceh tsunami case only. So my presentation that would be in two parts. One is that I would like to share what I saw and experienced in Aceh, and the second part is the gaps between objective and reality on the ground. Next slide, please. Hello, can we have next slide, please? Okay. First slide. What I learned is that the fact is immediate and fast assistance to help the survivor is the most important lesson, because it's not about how big the assistance is and what sector is, but what's so important is that how fast that assistance can be arrive and save a lot of people. So the lesson learned I would like to share is that the focus when we're working in disaster is that how fast we can deliver, not how much assistance that you can get from. So I think if I can share my personal experience, if your organization cannot guarantee delivering quickly assistance, I think better don't to help them, don't to go there, because it's a waste of resources. I saw that many things is people tend to help, tend to do everything, but it's never come until 5 years later, 10 years later, unless that you want to treat this assistance as an aid industry, as where you can get money. So I am really upset saying that happening in Aceh. Next, please. Then another lesson is that I think after a few months in Aceh, we have the BRR, which is a government agency, was set up to coordinate humanitarian aid in Aceh and NIAS. This is really good. I think is before the BRR was set up, I think it's people, organizations, or even you know, personal people come to Aceh, volunteer to come to Aceh. We don't know what to do, and it's kind of like chaos. But having those strong organization at the very strategic level, at ministerial level, is help implementing the assistance at the ground. And I think very important point I would like to make here is that without having those strong and powerful and trusted body to coordinate humanitarian aid, you can find a lot of, I would say, that humanitarian bandits. I don't know what the term is, but what I mean bandit is that those people, if an organization, local, international, national, come try to use this opportunity for their own benefit. So this only you can stop this and prevent this by having such a good and strong and powerful and trusted body to coordinate what do you call it, whoever involved in tsunami. And the lesson learned is also, particularly for our colleagues from international level, they should work with the system, have their, or even better if within, they shouldn't run their own show, having their own system, have their own program, and then you just ended up with flag tension or ego between those particularly big organizations who really want to have their name. And next. And also, I think I would like to talk now is about the gaps. I saw also the gap between the objective of humanitarian aid and the reality on the ground, because this objective has been talking in seminar, in conference, including what we are going to talking tonight. But is that really reflect in reality or not? This is what I saw or experienced. Is again, this is Aceh cases. It might not apply to other cases. One is that the ultimate aid objective is what? To help survivor immediately after disaster. But in reality at the ground, or it's the reality on the ground is that majority of aid come after survivor have died, or even they found their own way, and this is too late. I think I saw and experienced meeting with them. The money, for instance, the donor have to be spent. It's like few months after tsunami, but I think it's not polite to mention the name. But that is money is only come 5 years later. So what is for then? And I saw also, after tsunami, is that big organization, national, international, are busy with their donors, with their delegation from Washington, from London, from Jakarta. So I would say they more become a travel agent rather than aid workers, because I have found my personal, I'm so emotional when talk about this, because I experienced it. I saw people die and have a community meeting, have to decide whether we have to help them with housing or clean water, and the organization just said we only can provide housing. But then we cannot make decision because of the big people are just meeting with in Jakarta and they are even not in Banda Aceh, or you have to wait them from what? From Washington coming back, and then mostly that you send people to remote area, to the disaster area. Those local people is not the big boss, not the one who make decision making. So my suggestion is that I think whoever work, we should put survivor as a top management, a top priority as in management, and also the process decision have to be faster. I mean, if you have one grant and program, it cannot be more than 2 or 3 layers of a delivery, and this is not really helpful. You have a program from, let's say, from DFRED, from USA, then tender. The one who's won the project is international company, a big UN or even World Bank, and then they have to tender again. Then maybe the winner would be regional organization, and then they have tender again. The winner is national, then have to tender again, regional or national, then have to tender again. How many layers? How many timing? I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about helping people down there, and this is process drives me nuts. It drives me crazy. Last one is that I would like to say is the gaps. Also, you can see at the ground between expatriate, international actors, and local. I mean, I think it's not nice to see in this disaster area where expatriate drive fancy and luxurious car, living in the most expensive houses in the town, where local people drive the standard motorbike, using public houses, or even living in low quality housing. Expatriate, of course, pay very, very high, but you can question their productivity as well. Many of expatriates, we need that. They're extremely good, so that's fine. But most of the time, local pay quite low and get the most pressure from the ground. So this is my last slide. I would say that is, can humanitarian workers be paid on their expertise, on their quality, not their nationality? So very technical. My advice is that can we delete nomenclature, local, national, expatriate position in project design document? If not, this is treat people not inequal. While we promoting this working that equal, no standard SOP at the ground, you have double standard. So you have, when dealing with accommodation, all the stuff, then that they should treat different. I don't think this is right. And the last one is that we're talking about local capacity. Of course, its local capacity is very different. But what happened that involving them is not at lower level, but of course have to be at senior level, meaning is that at level who can make decisions. And I think this is SMT, senior management team level, have to consist of both local and international. International is good, bring best practices from other places, so we can learn from that. But having local, that we can adopt this lesson learned to put in the context. So this is somehow, if whoever work in this project, they have to get this good combination at the top level. I think that is, then we can discuss later on. Thank you. I give it to you. Give it back to you, John.
Azwar, thank you very, very much indeed for that. I think, all of us that listening to you there appreciate what you said very much, and it must have been very difficult for you to recall all the terrible things that you went through, and we're all very, very grateful to you for giving us such a personal and poignant picture of what happened at that time. Now, you brought up many important issues around funding and around timeliness, and around the relationship and the inequalities between the expatriates and local people, double standards, etc. And I'm sure we're going to pick up all of those points later when we come on to the questions. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to Jo De Silva, and I'm going to ask Jo to make her presentation. Jo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Azwar, for that presentation, which resonated very much with some of the things that I observed, even though I would fall into your category of international expert. My comments today are based on three things. Firstly, the year I spent in Sri Lanka in the first immediate aftermath of the tsunami, coordinating shelter, the transitional shelter program across the country, where we built 60,000 shelters, and I'll come back to that. I then went to Aceh. The first time I went to Aceh was 15 months after the tsunami had happened. I was horrified at the scale of devastation and the lack of progress. And I visited Aceh regularly over the next 3 years, contributing to the work of various agencies and doing some evaluations. And it was that that triggered me to start a specialist team in Arup, which we're a very big organization that has skills in the built environment. And I realized that there was a real lack of these skills and that I wanted to create a sort of specialist organization that could provide technical knowledge on the built environment, but apply it in contexts, including post-disaster contexts. And my team did work for with various organizations in Haiti also. Looking at the Indian Ocean tsunami and Haiti, it's actually very interesting to think about them as two disasters 5 years apart. In some ways they were similar in terms of scale. They affected around 1.7 million to 2 million people. More than 220,000 people lost their lives in each case, and the losses were somewhere between 7 and 10 billion. And if you actually look at Aceh and compare Aceh to Haiti, they were countries that had also got very low levels of GDP as a result of either poverty or conflict. So actually the scale of losses in those countries actually outstripped GDP. And I think it's very important when we're thinking about losses to understand the context in which they occur. In Aceh, there had been 30 years of conflict. Sri Lanka, areas of that country, had suffered from conflict before the tsunami, and Haiti was the poorest country in Latin America. And these are the really salient factors that actually shape the background of disasters, which too often I think the humanitarian community overlooks. They charge in to save lives, but actually pausing a little bit and thinking about where are we working, what kind of capacity is available, is really important. I echo Azwar's comment about the success of BRR. I would also say that in Sri Lanka, I was very fortunate in my job because I was working closely with the Sri Lankan government, who set up TAR4 and TAR-FREN as specialist agencies to manage the reconstruction. And so the issue of being able to work with governments was possible in those locations, whereas in Haiti it's been very challenging throughout. The thing that I thought about at the weekend in thinking about these disasters and thinking about the lessons learned from them, I thought there are lessons that were learnt in one, which I'll come on to, that have transferred to the other. But the question I then asked was, are these disasters typical? Are we dwelling too much on these very large-scale disasters that have a very big media profile and lots of money? And do they actually provide a good learning point for how the humanitarian community should move forwards? And I think maybe, John, that's a question we might bear in mind as we discuss. I picked on 4 key things that came out of the 2 conflicts that I think are very important. The first is I really would like the humanitarian community to recast its role as an enabler, a facilitator, not as a provider. And I think that that was a very key learning that came out of the tsunami response, was there is so much diversity of need, and in the countries affected by the tsunami, there was a very significant amount of local capacity, extremely able people who could make a contribution, but actually were marginalized as a result of the humanitarian community. And I really think that the humanitarian community need to be a little bit more humble about their role and realize they're there to help, they're not there to lead. And that it's about providing assistance to help others and finding out what type of assistance is needed. Is it financial assistance? And if so, it should be delivered through local actors. Is it technical assistance, knowledge and know-how? Or is it capacity building, actually shortage of human resources, and actually inserting people in local organizations might have a much bigger impact than working in parallel. The second key theme is competency. I think we really have to ask ourselves, should all humanitarian organizations have a right to be there? And and should there be some kind of screening or qualification, accreditation, to ensure that people on the ground actually are competent to do their jobs. After the tsunami, the amount of money that was available amounted to about $7,000 per person. Now you compare that to Bangladesh after the 2004 floods, and it was about $3 per person. So the situation after the tsunami is that you had humanitarian organizations with access to more money than they'd ever had access to before, working in an environment which was very, very broad in scale and in complexity. And it was also that the areas that had been destroyed, the coastal areas, were often very built up. And they were areas where actually one of the biggest issues was replacing infrastructure. I came across situations where you had international NGOs who thought that they could replace the main drainage system in Banda Aceh, which was absurd. And all the NGOs decided that they would get involved in reconstruction. But actually, when I did an evaluation in Aceh, out of all the NGOs engaged in reconstruction, only a handful of them had previous experience of construction. I have 25 years experience in the construction industry. It's extremely complex, and there is a reticence to involve construction experts in humanitarian contexts because the view is that we don't understand the humanitarian context, but the converse is true about humanitarians getting engaged in construction. I think humanitarians are, it's amazing what is achieved when they are able to provide timely life-saving aid in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. But I think when it came to the tsunami, there was mission creep. And I think in Aceh, there was a different challenge. I think a lot of learning had gone on in terms of construction, and people were loath to get involved in that. But people didn't understand the urban context. A lot of senior people in humanitarian organizations, the formative years of their careers were in places like Africa, dealing with very large-scale refugee camps in rural areas, and dealing with the complexities of a city such as Port-au-Prince, which has got many building typologies, huge infrastructure deficits, major issues of access even before the issue of rubble materialized, were really, I think, out of their league. And I think a key lesson is the next major urban disaster, who is actually going to be there to make the right strategic decisions and think about what the real critical issues in an urban context are. When I got to Sri Lanka, and I felt the same when I got to Aceh 15 months later, I was very thrown because neither emergency was anything like the emergencies I'd been involved in before, which are really characterized by shortage of funds and shortage of resources, human resources also. And for me, when I think back on the Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the things that was, the two things that were overwhelming was the scale of the disaster, but also the scale of the humanitarian response and the amount of competition that was going on between humanitarian agencies, vying for funds and in some cases even beneficiaries. That was in the early days, and I was happy to see that as things progressed, there was more and more recognition of the need for coordination between different agencies. And it's worth remembering that the tsunami was before the cluster system had been introduced. And I think one of the key learnings that came out of the tsunami was the importance of coordination. And but the way we've gone with the cluster system is it's a very sectoral coordination mechanism. And I think Haiti highlighted the limitations of that. Kunturu, who led the BRR in Aceh, also highlighted it in a presentation I heard from him recently, where he said the thing that baffled him most about the humanitarian response in Aceh was the fact that people were busy thinking in sectors rather than thinking about integrated solutions to help households and communities. And I think in Haiti that became even more apparent when it was recognized that the cluster and the sector coordination system doesn't sit neatly in an urban environment. And important issues like who is responsible for rubble removal take weeks and weeks to actually think through. So if coordination is important, I think the learning from Haiti is that we need to move beyond coordination to collaboration. And collaboration is only possible if there's a shared goal and a real willingness to work together to achieve this. It means creating teams of people who are willing to work together. And I share Azwar's view that those teams should comprise local as well as international actors. The shelter coordination mechanism in Aceh, when I arrived 15 months after the emergency, had 2 separate meetings each week, one with local actors in Bahasa and one with international expatriates in English. I was delighted 3 years later that that had shifted, and it was one meeting, and actually more and more of the international experts were learning to speak Bahasa. But there was never, for the shelter programs in Aceh or in Haiti, there was never a real vision set out about what everyone was trying to achieve, that different actors could unite behind and contribute in different ways, local actors as well as international actors. And I think one of the reasons...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Joe. Just for the benefits of time, I wonder if you could bring it to a close just now, because we do have to move on. That's all right. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think one of the successes in Sri Lanka was that there was a very clear vision set out that we wanted to create 60,000 shelters in order to get everyone out of tents before the rain. And within that, there were very many different pathways to achieve that. There wasn't just one response. And yet the transitional shelter program in Aceh and Haiti defaulted to this T-shelter program of just supplying individual shelters, which wasn't needs-driven, it was much more supply-driven. And that really is my final point, is that the essence of humanitarian response really needs to go back to being about saving lives and reducing suffering in the aftermath of a disaster, and secondly, really focusing on needs, and specifically the needs of the most vulnerable, and holding on to those key tenets of humanitarian response in these very large-scale, high media profile emergencies is particularly challenging, but I think they need to be our guiding stars. Thank you.
Joe, thank you so much for a very fluent, clear and really interesting presentation. You brought up so many points there. I'm sure we're going to pick up some of them in our question and answer session later on. I'm just going to pick out a couple of things that you said, which I just want to make the connection between some of your points and some of the recommendations that came out of the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition's major evaluation. And of course, the first one is that you made your point that you believe that the humanitarian system should be recast in the role of an enabler and a facilitator. And of course, this really resonates with what I suppose is now the famous recommendation from the TEC for a fundamental reorientation away from the international system and towards building on local capacities. And I suppose, one of the questions for all of us is, if 10 years later, do we think this has become part of the aid model that we use today or not? And the second thing that you did mention is the issue around competency and screening and qualifications. Now again, one of the recommendations from the TEC after the tsunami was to set up some kind of certification system for international NGOs. And for several years, no one's done anything about that, but I do know now that the Steering Committee for Humanitarian Response have just completed some research looking at the viabilities for setting up a certification system, and so I think we should all perhaps watch that one with interest as it unfolds. Now, let's move on, and we're going to move on now to Joseph Leitmann. And Joseph, it will be great to hear from you in freezing cold Washington, I understand. Please, Joseph, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to HPG and ALNAP for organizing this webinar. Selamat malam to Pa Azwar and our colleagues in Asia. Good afternoon to Joe and people listening in London, Europe, and Africa, and good morning to those of us in the Americas. I came to Indonesia a few months before the tsunami and got pulled into the damage and loss assessment and then organizing the multi-donor fund, and spent the next 4 years working on reconstruction. And shortly after returning to Washington, D.C., I got pulled into the work on recovery after the Haiti earthquake and also spent 4 years working on that. So the point I like to make from the beginning is that this is very much biased towards recovery finance and much more the recovery than the relief phase. And what I'd like to do is go over quickly 3 sets of lessons that I think I've learned in this process. The first links the relief phase with recovery and looks at what is the interface between the two. And the first lesson I'd like to highlight there is to use the assessment that's done right after the disaster, the post-disaster needs assessment or the damage and loss assessment, for recovery planning. And so often this doesn't happen, surprisingly. The assessment itself is a wealth of information, and for often institutional reasons, it gets set aside and a whole new set of information is generated for the recovery work. The second point I'd make is that we really need to retain the information as well as the social capital that has been developed for the relief phase and bring that into recovery. So often these are different institutions that are working on the different phases, and we lose that social capital moving from relief to recovery. A third point in this first set of lessons is that the decisions and the actions that are taken during the relief phase really shape much of what we can achieve during the reconstruction. And I just give 2 examples here. The first is during the initial days after the tsunami in Aceh, the military did an excellent job of disposing of a lot of the debris that was blocking the roads and blocking communities. But they just pushed it wherever they could, and we spent a lot of time and money removing the debris from places where it was inappropriately dumped and trying to recycle it. And that could have been avoided in the beginning. A much more graphic example is in Haiti, a few days after the earthquake. Many people were encouraged to settle in a very desolate plain on the outskirts of Port-au-Prince. And that has now become a settlement of over 120,000 people with no infrastructure, no services, and no economic foundation. So you can see how decisions made early on after the disaster can have consequences far down the line. And then a final point is that it's important to have a very clear phasing of relief going into recovery and then onwards to long-term development. This really helps decision makers to prioritize interventions, donors and the government to decide when and where to orient financing, and for the general affected population, it sets out clear expectations about what's going to happen when. Moving on to the next slide, the second set of lessons that I'd like to focus on is all about recovery. And the first point here is to try and embrace the ethos that emerged from the Aceh recovery about building back better, to use disaster as an opportunity, but also to make sure that we integrate disaster risk reduction measures into the investments that are made for reconstruction. Liliane Fan has written about this. She's in the audience, and she can tell us a little bit more about some of the complexities. It's not so easy to do this, but I think it's something important to strive for. Next point is a no-brainer, but it can have very significant impact, and that is to ensure that there's active participation in all phases of the recovery, from planning through to feedback on decisions that are made during the implementation phase, and to have third-party evaluation of performance in recovery. Just one quick example here of how powerful this can be. In Indonesia, the central government planners at the Ministry of Public Works thought it would be a great idea to exclude the population in Aceh from living within a kilometer of the coast so that they wouldn't be affected by future tsunamis. When this idea was taken to the people in Aceh, there was a massive rejection because that coastal area was the source of livelihoods, was the source of tradition, homes, property, and so on for so many people. And so the government had to find another way, and they instead decided to focus on things like escape routes, early warning systems, and awareness about the risks of disasters for the community. So, powerful example of how participation can make a difference. Another point is that there really has to be accountable leadership arrangements in place so that recovery is synchronized. That leadership and the government has to have information, it has to have options, and it has to have a decision-making will and power to move forward. A next lesson is that, and this was mentioned earlier, we really need to look at who can do what, who has the comparative advantages, and who has the proven capacity locally and internationally to deliver on the ground and work with those as priority partners. And as Pa Azwar said, avoid the bandits, whether they be local or international. And then finally, on recovery, we need to look at how economic opportunities are going to need to be phased over time. Initially, people need cash in hand to pay for necessities. And so it's very important to have cash for work programs in place. As you move into the reconstruction phase, we need to maximize the opportunities for locally procuring goods and services so that the massive amount of money coming in after these major disasters is captured by the local economy. At the same time, we have to be aware of the risks of inflation. In Aceh, after the first year of reconstruction, they faced 48% inflation. That dropped down to 22% in the second year. But that can have a real impact on the local economy, and it has to be considered. Wrapping up, the third set of lessons that I learned moving from Aceh to Haiti were, at least in recovery financing, the importance of centralizing leadership in the government. In Aceh, we had a tripartite arrangement between the World Bank, the EU as our largest donor, and the government of Indonesia to decide on financing. In Haiti, we said, why do we need the donor? Why do we need the World Bank? This should be in the hands of the government. Second thing we learned is we need to find ways of moving the money as quickly as possible. And so we were able to streamline the process of approving and transferring grants for implementation of reconstruction projects. A third lesson here is that it's important to have structures in place to work with partners. And we spent a lot of time, wasted a lot of time developing individual agreements with UN agencies in Aceh to pass money to them for implementation. Whereas in Haiti, we had a framework agreement that covered 32 UN agencies, so we didn't have to bother with that. And a final point on recovery financing is set the bar high for the price of admission for donors. In Indonesia, it was only $10 million contribution to have a seat at the table. We bumped that up to $30 million in Haiti, and that helped with our resource mobilization. To conclude, three things that we forgot moving from Aceh to Haiti. The first was to have a strong government-led coordination body. As has been mentioned by the previous two speakers, the BRR played that role in Aceh. The International Haiti Recovery Commission was feeble and unable to fulfill that role and did not move on to become a recovery agency. The second thing we forgot was to be able to set, monitor, and enforce standards of reconstruction, and then to control quality so that people were getting value for money in the recovery process. And finally, it's very important to rein in the donors who have their preferences, who want to steer money in particular directions. The idea of having a multi-donor recovery financing facility is to be able to fill gaps and maximize flexibility. In Haiti, the donors said they wanted to play that game, but in fact, they set preferences, and we had much less flexibility than in Aceh. I'll stop there, John, and there's specific questions that have come in that I'd be happy to answer, but I think we can do that in the general section.
Joseph, thank you very much for that. It was really great to get a kind of sequential movement from Aceh to Haiti there, and it was great also to get such a wise set of recommendations. I'm just thinking about what you're saying. There's a number of issues in the humanitarian world that never seem to go away for us, only get louder. And one of these, you've touched on it in your recovery financing bit, is about the unhelpful divide between the humanitarian and development communities. And, and of course, this is a complex question, of course. It involves different elements, including culture, institutional architecture, etc. But the question I'd like to put to you now, if I may, is about money and funding. And do you think we, as a community, are dealing properly with the continued fragmentation of funding between humanitarian and development funds? And I wonder, from your perspective, how can we also work towards making sure that some sectors are not overfunded or underfunded? And you mentioned that Liliane is here with us, and we're delighted that she is here with us at the moment. I read her very, very interesting blog a few days ago, and she was saying that that she believes that there's too much emphasis on reconstructing houses in Aceh at the expense of rebuilding livelihoods. And so I guess my question to you is, how can we deal with this divide, this fragmentation between humanitarian and development funding lines, and making sure that the right things get funded? Joseph, maybe you could have a crack at responding to that question. Thank you.
Sure, let me give it a try, John. I think that part of the problem is institutional, that you have different groups who are mobilizing financing for the different phases. So in the relief phase, it will typically be the Red Cross or the UN Flash Appeal that mobilizes a lot of money. And then in the reconstruction phase, you've got different actors, the bilateral donors or the EU, or you've got the multi-donor funds. And there can be relatively little communication between the two communities. So involving each set of actors in the earlier or the later phase, I think, is one solution. Another solution is to be prepared in advance. And one option for doing this is to have the money set aside in a rainy day or a contingency fund in case disasters come up. Indonesia is doing that both with its national budget and through the Indonesia Reconstruction Fund. Or you can have standby financing where you've pre-qualified to borrow money that can quickly flow through the government for reconstruction. And then a third solution is to have strong government coordination so that both phases are managed by the same entity and that they can see the big picture and make the links from relief to recovery.
Joseph, that's really, really helpful. I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come in from others. We have a question from a gentleman called Dave Hampton. I don't know where Dave come from, but he says, what lessons were learned in these two specific instances about disaster, how disaster response ties into longer-term development? And there's a gentleman from George Washington University called George Haddo, just down the road from you, I assume, and he asked, were disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures integrated into recovery efforts to reduce future impacts? And I think you mentioned both of those points in your presentation. Maybe, Joseph, I wonder, maybe could you comment on Dave and George's question there? Thank you.
Yeah, let me take them together about integration of risk reduction, be it climate risk or disaster risk, into recovery. I think that you saw good examples of this in both cases. In Aceh, there was a strong emphasis in monitoring, especially the housing sector, to make sure that the new housing stock that was built was earthquake resistant and storm resistant, and that was done by both Achenese and international engineers, and done to varying degrees of success, but I think it was a conscious effort. There was also a lot of work done to try and minimize the environmental impact of sourcing the reconstruction materials, and through conscious design efforts, the amount of wood that was needed to rebuild was reduced from 10 cubic meters to 1 cubic meter per house, and that reduced the demand on Aceh's forests. In Haiti, an example of how the integration of climate risk reduction measures paid off was the investment that was made in disaster risk management and setting up a situation room and a capacity to respond to the most frequent risks that hit Haiti, which are tropical storms and hurricanes. So we saw this pay off when Hurricane Sandy and a couple of other hurricanes hit Haiti. 5 amazing things happened in an integrated way. First, the government was aware that the disaster was on its way. Second, they had the means of informing the population about what was about to take place. Third, they knew where the most vulnerable populations were. Fourth, there were shelters in place where people could be moved and the logistics to actually move them. And fifth, for the people who were coming out of camps, there was a program in place to resettle them in their neighborhoods of origin so that they didn't repopulate the camps. Now, in a place like Haiti, any one of those things happening is a miracle. For 5 of them to happen in sequence is just truly amazing.
Joseph, that's absolutely fascinating. You know, we've had a live question just come in now that I'm also going to put to you, and it's from a gentleman called John Bevan from London, who is the former head of the affairs for the United Nations in Haiti. Is that correct? I'm getting a nod here from my colleagues. And John is asking this. You may be in a position to help here, Joseph. He says, do we know what the current situation of the 1.5 million people who have left the IDP camps in Haiti is? Are they now in precarious housing and vulnerable to future distress? And so I'm going to ask this to Joseph first, and then maybe Joe De Silva may have an idea about this as well. But Joseph, over to you if you know anything about this.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
You can.
You can hear me. Okay. Yeah, so immediately after the earthquake, 1.5 million people were displaced, many of them into camps of varying quality, and many of them unfortunately stayed years and years in those camps. We're now down to about 70,000 people who are still living in camps from the 1.5 million. And that attrition is partly just natural. Partly it's through the initiative of individuals, partly it's through programs like the 16-6 program that provided rental vouchers, or rental finance for people to move from the camps. You have to remember that in Haiti, unlike Aceh, the significant portion of people who were displaced were renters and not owners. And so the traditional approaches of community-driven housing wouldn't work. People didn't have the incentive to rebuild someone else's property, and they didn't have the right to. So in terms of where people have resettled, the easiest group to track are the ones, about 100 to 120,000, who received assistance from the 16-6 program, because they had to move into places that were certified as earthquake and storm resistant. So we know that they're in relatively good shape. Another group of people who were property owners moved back and received assistance, including technical assistance for building back better. But I think that we can't really say much about the overwhelming majority of people. And if they moved back to the housing stock that was already in place, then I'd have to say that quite a few of them are still at risk, because the housing stock that has been built in Haiti was built primarily to resist storms, and not to resist earthquakes. And so the structures are weak, and we know where the likelihood of the next earthquake is going to hit. It's primarily going to be in the north of the country. And there are programs in place led by the United Nations to help people to begin to cope with, to understand the risks, and to retrofit structures such as schools and hospitals that are most at risk. So that's a long answer to a complicated question.
Joseph, thank you very much for that. You know, John Bevan is also asking, which is linked to that, and this is a question I'm going to put now to Joe Da Silva. And he's asking why we have not achieved our ambition to build back better. And inevitably, you know, we see slogans like this cropping up the whole time, and we also get in the new policy areas emerging like resilience. And the underlying message here is that it seems to be that aid can improve what was there before the disaster struck. And I think it was Joe Da Silva made some points about the GDP and the conditions in both Aceh and Port-au-Prince before these emergencies struck. And so one of the questions is, you know, what can we reasonably expect the humanitarian system to deliver? Is it realistic to really believe that the humanitarian system, even if it is linked to the development world, can build back better? So I'm going to put that question to Joe Da Silva first. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, John. The phrase "build back better" emerged out of the tsunami crisis. It took over a previous phrase that used to exist, which was all about using the window of opportunity post-disaster to reduce long-term vulnerability. And more recently, people are moving away from build back better to talking about how we use the opportunity afforded by disaster to actually create more resilient communities. Personally, I really have trouble with the word build back better. Firstly, because it's got the word build in it, which automatically means that people focus on the physical, particularly in the aftermath of an earthquake, where that is the most visible manifestation of a disaster. And then people tend to focus on reconstruction, and we talk about reconstruction, and again that focuses on the physical. But if actually what we're trying to do is reduce vulnerability to future disasters, we have to be thinking about building resilient communities. And that's about restoring social networks as much as about having robust shelter. It's very much about getting the economy going and enabling people access to livelihoods. So I think if we're going to latch onto phrases, we need to be a little bit careful. Secondly, I can't overemphasize the issue of those 1.5 million people that were in camps. You know, where are they today, but where were they before the disaster? In order to judge whether the response to Haiti was effective, I think we need to judge it in terms of how many lives might have been lost that weren't lost, and how many people's lives have been improved, and how many people are going to be less vulnerable to the next major hurricane or earthquake that happens in that region. And the metrics that we're using, which is about numbers of houses built or numbers of people left camps, are not metrics that actually are judging these fundamental outcomes of success as to whether a response has been successful. In Sri Lanka after the tsunami, I can wholeheartedly say that the humanitarian response was successful because only one person lost their life after the immediate day that the tsunami happened, and that was a young girl who set her tent on fire accidentally with a hurricane lamp. And many more people would have lost their lives if the Sri Lankan people hadn't helped each other and aid got there quickly. So that was a success. But I've not seen anything in terms of Haiti or Aceh which actually looks at how were people living before, what happened to them, there was a major disruption in their lives, and are they actually in a better place now, and more importantly, on a better trajectory now than they were previously? And I think if we could see the contribution that the humanitarian community make in that bigger framing that includes before, after the response, and the longer term, it would help us to maybe be less critical, but I mean be critical for the right reasons in terms of outcomes.
Joe, thank you very much for that. I guess that that's partly a question, isn't it, for the research community and indeed the evaluation community to ensure that the reflections are joined up and that baseline data is in place and the evidential base it should be stronger. But I'm going to turn now to Azwar to hear what he thinks about Build Back Better. You know, Azwar, you've been living in Aceh for many years. You were born there, I understand, and you are the founder of a national movement to encourage people to make the world a better place and promote sustainable development through education and economic development. You have seen what Aceh was like. You were there before the tsunami and what it's like now. Has the international community, in your view, really improved the situation in Aceh or not? So Azwar, please have a go at answering that question if you can.
Sure. Thanks, John. I think this conversation remind me maybe like 2 months after tsunami, it was that I talked about this with last mayor of Banda Aceh, and I think if you question, is that possible, build back Aceh better? Yes, possible. But whether that is realistic or not, that is question. I would say not in disaster stage. Because that time I've been discussing, I proposed myself to Mayor Pak Mawardi that time, can I be the involving in those spatial planning, build better this sub-district of Meraksa, because that is, I think, in terms of opportunity, that is the opportunity to make to build back city better, because then you know they can start the good road, public road, sanitation, everything. But then that's why then is our program in Aceh at that time is also community land mapping, spatial planning for the village. We see the village people and then what should we do. But then as Joseph mentioned earlier is that you have like blueprint from the national government, like try to moving people from the ocean from the ocean to prevent them from the future tsunami. But then you have very good national planning, have very good city plan for this, but it doesn't work because many reasons. Why I'm thinking also because of the capacity of local government, because it's been in conflict for 30 years, and also whether the community want to live in different area, because most of them are fishermen, and suddenly we have to move them to the mountainside, for instance, if you want to use more space for better road or better public facilities in Banda Aceh. So it doesn't work. Then also, I agree with Joe da Silva, this is not a priority because build is interpreted more on infrastructure thing. So the priority, I think, is for relief stage is saving life as many as possible. So not building the physics and all the stuff. The second question is that whole life now, I think it's getting much better. Of course, the road is in Banda Aceh is much bigger and wider, but not in the other area, I think. I think That is I don't know. My personal opinion is I think is much better now. Is that because of tsunami or because of humanitarian worker or because the conflict has been ended? So it was before tsunami conflict, so people even cannot go to what they call it, to go to market. They cannot go. You know, it was very hard. So now it's like it is like a normal city in other places.
Azwar, thanks so much for that. I've just been handed a note here just to remind all of you who are listening, please do send in your questions. We are getting them in, but it would be great to hear other people's thoughts. And I'm going to turn to a question now that's been posed by a lady called Chiara Malucci from UNDP in New York. And Chiara's picked up on a point that that Joe De Silva made, and indeed I also commented that it was a recommendation from the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition's reports all those years ago. And Chiara says, who could take the lead in screening the humanitarians and other international actors in terms of their capacity to undertake certain, I can't read this writing here, certain, anyone help me there? Their tasks. Should this go through the cluster system or the government? And what if there is no capacity to do it, like in Haiti? So there's an issue there about screening, certification, and how this plays out in the cluster system, and who should do it. So it's a kind of multi-layered question there. I'm going to ask, I think, Joe De Silva to have a go at that question, Joe, if you may.
Yes, I wasn't, my starting point wasn't to promote another bureaucratic process. It was really to start with organizations involved in humanitarian assistance reflecting on their competencies and actually being more reflective on whether their competencies are the right set of competencies for a situation. I think there's a tendency for agencies to seek to put their expertise or what has worked elsewhere into practice rather than the response being needs-driven. So people turn up and are putting applications into donors because that's what donors require very early on in the process. But those aren't necessarily the things that are needed, and those organizations don't necessarily have the competencies to deliver. I think that the donors play a big role in this rather than the clusters or the government. I think the major donors who are allocating funds to agencies, and particularly where funds are pre-allocated, so they're not related directly to that response, they're essentially agencies that they use as regular implementing partners. I think there's a strong onus on donors to make sure that their regular implementing partners can really implement the types of things they're wanting to fund. In Sri Lanka, the government actually did try and turn away a number of humanitarian organizations. My counterpart, I was working for UNHCR, and my counterpart in government who was leading the relief effort, he was completely baffled by the way everything operated, that basically any international organization could just turn up in country and help. And he said it was a bit as though if he was very ill or severely injured and he turned up at a hospital and he wanted to see the person who knew how to help his particular injury, and everyone turned up from the medical students to the administration of the hospital, and everyone was offering help, and he was the one who was meant to be able to pick and choose and find the right person to help him. And I think there's more to be done in terms of the way the humanitarian community is organized, for people to be clearer about their capability. I work in the private sector, and that's how it works. Organizations, in order to be able to work, have to demonstrate their capability and competency first before they're they're able to take action. And so in many major framework agreements with the public sector, those competencies are demonstrated in advance.
Joe, that's very clear. Thank you very much. I wonder, Joseph, in the World Bank, what's your position on agencies demonstrating competencies before they're allowed to move in to deal with reconstruction and recovery? Is there a line of thinking in the World Bank on this one? Over to you, Joseph.
Well, I think that the first response is that this should be primarily a national decision. Mm-hmm. Now, that's complicated because countries have different capacities. So in Indonesia, the BRR was able to vet and evaluate over time the performance of many of the NGOs and gradually move out the ones that were less productive, less well-performing. In Haiti, there was a system in place to register NGOs and civil society organizations, but on the one hand, it was perceived by many as a rent-seeking opportunity and not a serious exercise, and on the other hand, there were no consequences if you didn't comply with the system, whereas in Aceh, the BRR had the power to cut off your visa and or not renew visas. And so this was used to move some of the less serious NGOs out. The other option is really an international one, and there are organizations like the ISO, the International Standards Organization, that could provide certification in advance of disasters for humanitarian groups. This, of course, is not a low-cost exercise, and I think it would be more appropriate for the larger humanitarian organizations.
Josie, thank you for that. I was just wondering, listening to you speaking there, does the World Bank still have the World Bank Inspection Panel? Wasn't that a way in which agencies were held to account by people who were the recipients or beneficiaries of development aid? Over to you, Joseph.
Actually, it's the other way around. The inspection panel holds us accountable. So it's there to deal with complaints about the World Bank not complying with its rules and procedures. And so it's an independent group that looks at our own performance. Now, you could imagine having something like that set up for individual disasters or overall for the larger disasters going across time. But the inspection panel has a different function.
Josie, thank you very much for that. I'm going to pick this issue up in a slightly different way with a question that we have from a lady called Myrtle Zabala, and I'm going to direct this question to Azwar. And she says, Azwar, how do the humanitarians adapt to the local community in terms of standard operating procedures versus the inherent local procedures and culture? And so this is something that you mentioned in your presentation, and Myrtle would like to pick you up on that and get some more views. So Azwar, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Isabella. For tsunami in Aceh, it's a bit hard to give opinion. Some of them who are familiar with the culture, it would be easy or easier to adopt. But some of organizations in tsunami, like another panelist, I think Joe de Silva mentioned, is that tsunami brought a lot of resources, humanitarian resources, and even people no problem with funding. And you may find a lot of humanitarian workers become expert in everything. Like Joe de Silva mentioned, is that suddenly that one organization tried to do maybe that organization perhaps experience in in children or in education, and suddenly all of them are involving in infrastructure. Exactly that is what Silva mentioned. That is what I witnessed. That is what I experienced. Then and then building the infrastructure housing is not about building the infrastructure itself, housing itself, but building a culture. You have to understand the house, the type of the house, the room, even the toilet, many things involving, and that's why if you then see maybe quite a lot of public utilities is useless. Housing maybe is not reflect the community need or the survivor need. It can be you are from more developed country or different culture, is come up with certain concept, and you try to try to help them, let's say, build back better houses, but not for them. They may be not convenient with the way we arrange the house. Maybe they need the house like 50 meters above the land, but we then build them a concrete house. That is it's not all the cases, but this kind of thing that is I found it very interesting experience. Some of them, for instance, talking about healing for the people. Aceh, majority of people are Muslim, and if you having a training or workshop for healing, for instance, or let's say mentality healings, and you bring them with all those way of like with music, with put the light on and all the stuff, it's not make a people, a survivor, feel comfortable with those kind of way conducting the training or workshop for the survivor. Mostly of them would be more convenient when you took them and talk to them in the mosque or in a community center. So I not say, I don't know, I mean, but many international, that's why I'm saying is that despite my criticizing for the international, but many of them bring a lot of experience. Lillian is there, and she's been working everywhere, and many people also speak local language, not only Bahasa, even Bahasa Aceh, and can mingle with them, no problem eating food or spend the time in the local coffee shop. Many of them are very good, but Tsunami, I think also you can see many people that you never seen them before, you never hear them before, suddenly become all humanitarian workers or organizations. So that's why I don't know whether we need a certification or whatever. I don't know. But I think I just remember texting with Dr. Jamila, and she's founding the ASEAN Disaster Risk network at the RRN, which is for me is really helpful at the people from the local perspective, and you meet friends from other countries that you can share, and it's not only in conference but from the researcher, from the big organization. But we have in Asia what is called Dr. Jamilah Mahmud established EDRRN, that is bring all the actors from different countries, from different regions to share. I think it is on practical way. If I want to go for a conference or workshop, I want to hear is that how can I do that better in my organization. So I don't know, my answer is mixed to you, Zebela, and many of them do really good job, but it's not few do very bad thing. Is not they have living they have living with their own life or their own style.
Azwar, thank you so much for that. I do know that Joseph also wants an opportunity to respond to this question. And Joseph, I have another question that's come in which is very, very similar, so I'm going to read this one out so perhaps you could answer both. And the question is from Julia Stewart David from the European Commission, so maybe she's in Brussels, we're not sure, but her question is, are international humanitarian actors working closely enough with governments of disaster-affected countries? And so, Joseph, please, over to you.
Okay, let me take those separately. On the first one, to build on what Azwar was saying, I think it's fundamental that we respect local culture, traditions, and laws. And a curious example of this is in Aceh, very early on in the Reconstruction planning, there was a plea to not rebuild things as they were. And the specific plea was, please, when you rebuild Banda Aceh, do not rebuild the red light district. And I think that message was heard loud and clear. At the same time, there may be instances where local culture is not well suited to responding to the needs after a disaster. In Aceh, there was a patriarchal inheritance system embodied in law, yet so many of the surviving households were female-headed. And so it was necessary to change the local kanun, the local law, to allow for women to inherit property so that rebuilding could move forward. Now, this was recognized because there was a community process in place, a land re-adjudication process that made it very clear that there was a need for changing local standard operating procedures. And so I think that the solution is to make sure that you put communities in the driver's seat when you're planning and implementing recovery. On Julius's question about working with government, I think it depends on how the government is structured and how the Reconstruction actors who are international interface with government. On the government side, there needs to be a capacity, a focal point that allows people to get direction, get guidance, and have a dialogue. In Aceh, you had that very much with the BRR. In Haiti, it was much more business as usual. The donors felt that they weren't getting productive conversations with government, and they ended up much more doing their own thing. This isn't a wholesale truth. There were many attempts at consultation. Often they were productive, but it wasn't the standard operating procedure. So I think that you've got to have, on the one hand, a government with capacity and a focal point, and on the other hand, you have to have donors who are willing to play by the rules, as well as consequences if you don't play by the rules.
Joseph, thank you so much for those nuances and insights. Really, really, really interesting there. I'm just going to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned there about the internal systems for inheriting property and so on, and turn to Joe De Silva to ask Joe a specific question around shelter and land rights. And I wonder, Joe had a view on the difficulties around land rights. Questions around who owned the land. On what basis did the people own it, and what are the implications for ownership when rebuilding? Now, Joe, you must have been very well sighted on these difficulties, and it would be really useful for you to recap on what you saw in Aceh, and also, if possible, to take a view to give us an idea on whether what you saw in Aceh, the lessons that you saw there, were learned 5 years later after the Haiti earthquake. So, Joe, land rights, what's your take on that?
It's a huge issue. I think that the tsunami, really threw the spotlight on the issue of land rights. I think people thought that providing shelter was about providing structures and buildings. And what materialized is that one of the biggest issues was actually where are you going to put these shelters and houses, even if they're temporary. Do people actually own the land on which they want to put these buildings? The big difference. So I'll stick with the tsunami first. There are two levels of this. One is prior to a disaster, is there an effective system for formalizing land rights? And then secondly, is that system still in place after the disaster? because what happened as a result of the tsunami, that the documentation that actually showed who owned what land where, much of it got lost. People found ways around that. There was a lot of cadastral mapping done with communities to re-establish who owned land. The issue of transitional shelter, managed to overcome it by saying this is transitional shelter, and actually then there was a right to stay on a piece of land and locate that shelter on a piece of land for a couple of years, negotiated. But when it came to reconstruction, the issue of there not being enough land to build houses on actually became the thing that delayed reconstruction. So people weren't willing to build houses until the land rights were resolved. So the tsunami threw the spotlight on the issue, and that issue was then taken, that lesson was learned, but it was then taken to Haiti, and people didn't really, at the beginning in Haiti, recognize that the issue of land rights in Haiti is completely different for two reasons. Firstly, because something like 70% of the people in Haiti were renters, so it wasn't a question of whether, ownership of property and ownership of land. And secondly, it was an urban environment where there were many multi-occupancy buildings that were multi-story buildings, so it wasn't the same issue in terms of land rights. And the thing became much, much more complicated. I think where we are honestly today in the shelter sector is I think we're at the beginning of a very steep learning curve on this issue. There are people like Lillian Fan, again to mention her, who did fabulous work in Aceh, putting the rights of renters and squatters on the table, because they were only about 10% of the people. There were amazing things done in Aceh in terms of understanding people's rights under Sharia law, and how that could be applied in the humanitarian context. But that information is very, very fragmented. And I'm very well aware as a shelter expert, if I was going to another emergency next week, there isn't something which gives even a clear language and terminology to think about land rights, rights of occupancy, rights of renters and squatters, which humanitarians can actually apply and use. And at the moment, I think what's happening is relying on a network of individuals who have that type of expertise in different organizations.
Joe, thank you so much for that. The question I asked you there and the answer that you have given, it's just the thin end of a very, very, very big wedge, isn't it? We could talk about this for a very, very long time. And we're not going to, because we only have a short amount of time left. And so I'm going to ask one last question, and it's a question from Lillian, who's been mentioned a few times and is with us here at the moment. And the question is this: given that the cluster system has a track record of contributing to more compartmentalization and fragmentation of aid and recovery efforts, is it finally time for a dramatic reform of the humanitarian system that puts national actors rather than the UN and NGOs at the center? And so I'm going to let each of you 30 seconds, and please, if you can. Do we need radical reform of the humanitarian system is what Lillian is asking, or do you think that we have the right kind of system and what we really need is incremental improvements? And so I'm going to start with, let's start with Joseph. Do we need radical reform, Joseph, or incremental change and improvement?
Well, I think that we need a radical change in two senses. One, something better than the cluster system that ideally is driven by national actors, but we have to keep in mind that those national actors may not have the capacity, the vision, or the goodwill to actually drive that system. So we may be looking more at partnerships. And I think that we have to expand the membership of the cluster system beyond the UN community and the NGO community to include the full range of actors in reconstruction.
Joseph, thank you. That was a great answer, and within the time frame. Well done. Joe, radical reform or incremental improvements? What do we need?
Well, if I think back to 10 years ago when the cluster system didn't exist at all, I think particularly in big and large and complex emergencies, there have been benefits. In the shelter sector, the fact the shelter cluster exists has created a community of shelter practitioners that didn't exist 10 years ago in the same way, and the amount of knowledge in the sector has increased radically. So I'm not all for throwing it out. I think it just needs to be turned upside down so that the culture and focus is on national response and the role of the clusters to support that, rather than it turning into going in the other direction and becoming more and more of a humanitarian industry. So I think it is incremental, but I think even actually turning it upside down and saying what comes first is the national actors, and that the role, and really emphasizing that the role of the humanitarian community, whether it's NGOs, the UN, the Red Cross or World Banks, that collectively their role is to assist. And I think that's a cultural change rather than an architectural change.
Joe, that's a great answer, and we're going to let Azwar, please Azwar, have the final word. Do we need radical reform of this international humanitarian system? Over to you.
Yes. In Indonesian context, I'm talking in Indonesian context, absolutely yes. We need radical reform. Because let us a question from those who's working in humanitarian work. I mean, what of the reason are involving and come to Aceh besides their modest willingness to come, but later on you found that many people come for money. Many organizations come also for money, including local, including many people. So why I say that need radical reform? Because like you said that national capacity, I don't have no doubt in national capacity. Whoever working in Indonesia, or you can ask, I think you have now many organizations also can do a lot of work. And at the end of the day, if we don't have radical reform in humanitarian work, it's never changed. Why? First, that how you can design the program, scoping mission of the work, you need assessment and all the stuff. If everything is by international level, it takes time, edges and edges and edges, and it's never, it takes time to make it happen. So the second is that, if I mentioned in my presentation, I think don't have double standard when you do humanitarian work. I really upset. From many point of view, I really, and I will say again and again, in every second opportunity in my life, is not equal, is not fair, is not human to treat and pay people based on their nationality. People, whoever they are, they should be paid by quality, by experience, not by their colors. This is radical reform, Lilian. Say that everywhere. So you can be the leader. The color people can be the leader. But I piss off anytime I see project design document mentioning that national position, international position, local position. At the end of the day, very often when you're working in day-to-day, they just can't speak English. They even don't know what the technical expertise is. So don't tell me if we don't need radical reform within humanitarian system. The humanitarian system, SOP, human resource, and everything, it just attract capitalists to work in humanitarian work. I think we have, it's all our duty and obligation to develop SOP, procedure, whatever, to get right people. Right people to get right people who working in humanitarian work. I mean right people, that people who want to come to work with passion, with their heart, not to come because of the money, the payment. How you can change this, change the system? Thank you.
Azwar, thank you so much for that. Passionate ending, much food for thought. Just one or two small points before we wrap up here. There is a recording of this webinar which will be available on the ALNAP website by the end of the week, I'm told. So if you would like to inform your colleagues or listen to it again, please do so. There's also a blog post on the ALNAP website, a blog called Hunter-Gatherers Response to the Indian Ocean Tsunami, an Aspiration for the International Humanitarian System, which I recommend you read. I'd also like to refer you to the HPN blog series on Haiti lessons learned and disaster as an opportunity report. Good, all right. Just remains for me to say now, really, thank you so much to our three presenters, Joe, Azwar, and Joseph. Thank you all to all of you who submitted questions. And all of you that submitted questions as we were going along as well, and really for tuning into what I feel has been a very fascinating, constructive discussion. And I'm looking around at my colleagues here. I don't think there's anything else to say except thank you very much. Have a wonderful